Hey everyone, welcome to Above Down, Inside Out. I am your host, Dr. Natasha Nelson. I think today is one of the pivotal episodes about what I do. So I've explained the pillars of health and what those are, but really at the root and the core comes down to what do we do and how do we cope with life when it feels uncomfortable and challenging, traumatic, all of the hard stuff of life. What do we do in order to survive? And so that's what I want to talk about today, because that is at the root of our health and all five pillars. It's what we do. It's our life. It's how our life looks, how it exists. A lot of it is based on some that are conscious, but a lot that are unconscious. The decisions, the actions, the choices we make, how we get to where we are. And so, I've shared before that I grew up in a really chaotic home. My father was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he became very violent. And he was 6'4". He was a big guy. And my mom was very withdrawn. She would shut down. And that's what I learned to do to cope. To cope when I was afraid, when I didn't know what was going on, when I didn't know what else to do, with all of the feelings and the emotions that I didn't know what to do with those. I didn't know how to handle them. I shut down. I remember times where one of the ways I learned to cope with my dad was I would learn his behaviors. I would learn to read how he walked. When he walked into the room, I could feel the energy, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. I remember, for a long time, I would even kind of read a room when I would walk in to see if my dad was angry or if anybody else was angry, because that's a way that I learned to survive, to know what I was walking into when things felt so unknown for me. And after my parents divorced, I thought, okay, good, I'm done. I'll never have to deal with that again. Right? You're laughing with me, I know, because that's a familiar statement we've all made at some point in our life, which is, hey, the issue isn't there, so I don't have to deal with it because it's gone and I don't have to ever worry about it again. And we laugh because we know, like for me, it came up and decades later, I had to deal with it. Another way, like for me, and the reason I share is it might be familiar for you too on some level, which is, so when I was about 11, my grandmother passed away, and she was my pillar and stability. And when she passed, life just felt so unstable. And again, I had never learned how to cope with painful emotions, uncomfortable parts of life. And shortly after, my mom sent me to Europe to be with family and her friends. And, my mom didn't know what to do with me for the summer. And while I wanted to be home with her and my friends, I think she wanted the same thing and wanted me to be happy, but we didn't talk about anything. So I learned to use food to cope. And I learned to use food to soothe myself when life felt really uncomfortable and uncertain. And while I thought, once I got back home after summer, I went to school and I thought, oh, life is great. I don't have to worry about it. Everything's fine. It was a decade later that I actually had to go back and revisit all of those issues as well. So I bring those up just as a share that you might recognize some of those patterns in yourself. But really at the core, what today and really what it's about is How do you cope when life feels scary and really hard? Because there are behaviors and actions that, yes, they can cope and they can soothe. They can lead to addictions that at some point in time will start to really interfere with the quality of your life. And it's easy to recognize, drugs and alcohol and devices and as the obvious addictions. But there are a lot that are really subtle that we don't realize that are operating, and they are how our default go-to mechanisms are in play. And if we don't recognize that they're happening, it's not till the end where you go, well, what happened? How did I get here? And so addictions are really coping behaviors to the point where you feel like they are out of control. And this can be actions, it can be behaviors, substances, people, things. So some of the top coping behaviors, as I said, can be food, alcohol, devices. Those are the three most commonly used and abused, and at the top. But it's not until you really understand the underlying issue and really understand what's driving it, because what makes addictions so hard to break is that if you don't get to the root of the issue, all you're going to do is transfer one addiction and one addictive behavior to something else. So if all you're doing is trying to address food and eating healthier and cleaning up your diet, okay, that's great. But if food was your source of comfort, until you deal with the issue that you are trying to soothe with food, while you might not deal with it with food, and you might not cope with food anymore, you'll find another way to cope until you get to the root of it. And this is, there are a lot of issues that I have with, Ozempic and all of those classification of drugs, is that, there's so many issues. Yes, you may not feel the craving for food, but the craving for soothing yourself doesn't go away. So you'll find another way to soothe your discomfort in other ways, even if food is no longer what you crave. So I want to break down a couple categories of these coping behaviors to help you understand where you might be, I don't want to say it's an addiction yet, but it's like, where are you stumbling and unconsciously sabotaging yourself that you may not even recognize it? Because sometimes you can have behaviors that are actually good and they're healthy and you need to be doing them, but it's the intention below the surface that lets you know when is the behavior becoming an unhealthy coping pattern. So here are a couple examples. Ready? Are you working later or longer than necessary to avoid going home? Because if there's something you're avoiding and you're like, oh, I'll just stay at work longer, I'll work later, that's a sign that's letting you know you're crossing into the unhealthy behavior patterns to cope category. So the same can be said about working out. Working out is healthy, we need to, but there's a gray zone that are you crossing over because you're trying to avoid people or avoid being home or avoid working, something that you are avoiding that you'd rather just go and work out longer or again or twice in a day, 3 times to avoid. What about reading? reading is. We need to read. Reading is how we learn and we grow. But is it interfering with your ability to talk to people, to have a conversation, to engage with life? Reading, there's such a gray zone here, because while reading is about learning and growing and the knowledge, but if you get to a place where you're reading so that you can escape and allow your mind to escape into a fantasy, and you're doing so much of that, you're losing touch with your reality, that's an issue. Or about reading all of the self-help books and reading all of the self-transformation, that's the new word, books. But you don't do any of the exercises. All you do is read them and read them and read them, but you don't do anything about it or with it. That's how you know. So here are some of the behaviors that are important for life and required to function, but that can become unhealthy. Think about picking fights. Picking fights with people. Physically, you can be trying to pick fights and bullying people and trying to bait them into it. But this is also verbal. Verbally, there's a debate, there's a healthy place of debating and sharing ideas, but it's the intention below that if you're doing it to argue, to fight, to win at all costs, that's the unhealthy behavior, which means there's something else going on that you're trying to avoid. What about having extreme set of rules that you live by? I mean, so extreme that they're so rigid that there's no room for flexibility at all. How about the behavior of your schedule is so jam-packed that there's no breathing room in there? Like, there's no room for downtime. You don't want downtime, so you fill it with something. You fill it with running an errand and doing something else just so that it can be full from the moment you wake up until you go to bed. There's a place for, cleaning and organizing, but it's the constant cleaning, constant organizing. Do you start projects that you don't even complete and you don't finish just because you want something to do, something to take time and waste time, right? Or make the time go by faster. And of course, being a perfectionist. This is one of the mind's favorite ways, because it's being in pursuit of something that you can never complete. You can never get there because perfection doesn't exist. So it's a great way to get lost in the idea of I'm doing something and I'm perfecting it, and you never get there. So you get lost in that, and that's what allows you to avoid the reality of what may be going on. So there are other things that can be unhealthy and overlooked, and because they're subtle. They're subtle. So I talked about you might have food restrictions, but rules that are too rigid, and they're not medically necessary. Only you know that. You know it, but it's allowing yourself to acknowledge it and be honest. It's that need to be constantly busy and hyper-scheduled. It's also job hopping or relationship hopping. You keep hopping to the next, always in search of something more or something better. It's parallel to the perfectionist idea, looking for the perfect job, the perfect partner, the perfect friend, and just as if perfection exists. And this is also the one that, if you're on the receiving end, you realize it. But it's being aware of if you're the one actively in it, which is the judgments and the constant criticisms. The criticisms that are the small, the nitpicking, that the constant that's running in your mind against yourself or against others, but it's the ones that we are constant critics and in judgment of ourselves that we don't realize we're doing, that will inherently be a coping behavior that we use to cope. So those are some of the signs that you are survival. Some of the signs are that you reached a goal and that you still feel empty. Do you feel used or abused? And kind of shutting yourself down, disengaged from life. Do you feel like you're being taken advantage of or being preyed on or manipulated? Are you engaging in the cycles of drama and chaos and the silent treatment? Those are all symptoms of coping behaviors and these patterns that are ruining your ability to connect with people and with life and engage in healthy ways. So today this was the episode that I want to just really start to open your mind about the unhealthy ways that you cope with life that can be subtle or not so subtle. And how to start is just to allow yourself the space to slow down and pay attention to the actions and behaviors that you are engaging in every day, and really understanding, well, why are you doing it? What's the inherent intention below the surface? Because if you're trying to avoid what feels uncomfortable, then it's a behavior that you're using to cope when you do it regularly, consistently, and it's your natural just go-to. So that's what we're going to leave it today. I'll talk more about addictions specifically on a future episode. So today, I want you to start to think about, what are you doing that's unhealthy to cope? So leave me a comment, send me a question, comments, share the episode if it's helpful for you, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and get the notifications for each episode when it comes up. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate your feedback. I'm Dr. Natasha Nelson. Until next time, stay healthy.